I'm Michelle Nijhuis, and I'm a freelance science and environmental writer. I have a background in biology. I don't have a formal training in journalism, a graduate degree in journalism or anything like that. I had always enjoyed writing. When I graduated from college, I worked at a couple of seasonal research jobs, and I then got an internship at High Country News, which is a newspaper that covers environmental policy and natural resource issues all around the American West. It's a regional, twice-a-month newspaper. And so that was great on-the-ground training in journalism, and it also taught me a lot about environmental journalism as a beat, which I was really interested in pursuing. So I considered that my graduate degree in journalism. After that, I was hired on staff at HCN and stayed at High Country News for about 4 years and left as a senior editor. Since then, for the past 7 years, I've been a freelance journalist focusing on magazine writing. I do some newspaper work, but mostly long-form magazine writing about global change and conservation issues, mostly in the West, but elsewhere as well. A lot of my stories are very research intensive. Most of my research is in the form of interviews with scientists. Because I'm a magazine writer, I definitely prefer to get out in the field with scientists and talk to them in their element, either in the lab or in the field, just because they tend to, there's more to see, there's more to describe. They tend to be more animated and excited about what they're doing than if I'm just talking to them on the phone. I also do a fair amount of library research. Fair number of my stories have a significant historical aspect. I write occasionally for Smithsonian Magazine, and there's usually some sort of historical element there. Many other stories will, require me to know a little bit about, say, the history of the environmental movement or, the history of a particular scientific field. So I do a fair amount of library work and, just reading of scientific papers so that I can ask intelligent questions when I do talk to scientists in the field, and I don't have to ask them to start from square one. I think that there's definitely a danger in being too knowledgeable when you go into the field with scientists, because you do want to be naive enough so that you're on the reader's side, that you're asking questions that the readers themselves are going to want to know. And if you know too much, you might be skipping ahead to, very complex sort of controversies or questions that the first-time reader might not care about at all. So, I will definitely, skim through the researcher's body of work, read a few papers, familiarize myself with the field. But I don't try and become one of their graduate students or become one of their colleagues. I want to be able to ask questions from a very naive perspective. I'll get a hold of a lot of books. As a journalist, I'm often working on a tight deadline. I don't have time to sit down and read half a dozen books from beginning to end. So you get really good at skimming or just reading the relevant chapters, things like that. So I'll, as I'm doing that, as I'm skimming or reading chapters or reading whole books when it's very important, I will take notes. I will sometimes type up those notes and plug them into a big, giant computer file I have of my transcribed interview notes and other things that I think might be important to the story. And then as it gets time to write, I will go through that long file, which can, it can be like 50, 100 pages sometimes, depending on the scope of the article. And I'll pull out elements that I know I want to go in the story. So it won't be structured, it won't be beautifully put, it'll be really messy, but I'll at least know, oh, I read that fact in a book and that was really a great detail. I know I want to throw that in, so I'll put it in this big, Word document that kind of acts as a catch-all while I'm deciding how to structure the story. The interview notes, are of course organized by the person, by the book, by that kind of thing, so that they're, fairly easy for me to read. I know there are computer programs that help writers organize their information in a more sophisticated way, but I haven't, this process has worked for me for years, and it's fine. So I haven't felt the need to look into those programs. So yeah, and when I sort of make that preliminary bin of information that's not yet organized, then I'll go through and see what I have, and then I'll think about structure. Usually at some point in the field I've thought about, well, I'm already thinking about structure, but just in my head, I might take a few notes, but I'll have thought about, well, what could be the lead scene here? What could my scenes be? So there's a sense of organization, but it's not formal until I really know what I have. I do, occasionally I take notes to just force myself to pay attention, like many people do when they're reading academic work. You just make sure that you're picking up what you want to pick up. I will, if there's often I'm looking for, kind of a pithy historical detail that will help me, sum up this, entire book or entire, body of work in a few sentences. So I'll definitely take down those details or scenes. Occasionally I will use a scene that, especially if it's a story where I haven't been able to travel, I will, use a scene from the book that I credit to the book, just as a way of telling a story within a story. In the fall, I wrote a story, or I should say in the spring of 2007, I researched a story on Thoreau, Henry David Thoreau, and his work at Walden Pond. He did some botanical research at Walden Pond, extremely detailed research that scientists are now revisiting, and they're resurveying the exact same plants or exact same places and species, and finding that the flowers are the majority of flowers are blooming earlier than they were when Thoreau was doing his work in the mid-1800s. So that's a story I was assigned to write for Smithsonian Magazine. It was a science story. Obviously, it's about climate change, but it's also a historical story. So I took a trip to Walden Pond, spent a couple of, I think 3 days total, walking around with these scientists. It was a professor at Boston University and his graduate student, just sort of following them around, getting an idea of how they do what they do, talking to them about why they were interested in it, what motivated them, what was interesting to them. And that helped me build some scenes, modern day scenes of them at the pond, doing funny things. They joked that they were just as obsessed as Thoreau had been. They had run-ins with the railroad police and that kind of thing as they were trying to chase down these unusual plants in the Walden Pond area.
Were you taking notes at that point?
Oh yeah. I mean, I either use a tape recorder or digital recorder, I should say. Sometimes I use analog tape if there's a lot of background noise, because digital recorders are really sensitive that way. Often when I'm in the field, I'm using a reporter's notebook and a pen and just taking notes the old-fashioned way. And I'm taking notes not only on what people say, but what I'm seeing, as much sensory detail as I can force myself to take in, what things smell like, even if it doesn't seem important at the time, what we ate, what they're wearing, what, and kind of my, often my impressions, what my impressions are of a particular person I'm interviewing, how they seem, how they talk, just so I can describe it later to the reader. 90% of that stuff doesn't make it in the story, but the 10% that does is crucial. So you try and sort of be this vacuum cleaner of detail when you're out in the field. Then, because there was this historical aspect, I spent a bunch of time in the Concord Public Library, which has a great collection of Thoreau, documents and memorabilia, and I picked up a lot of stuff there that allowed me to tell Thoreau's story, which a lot of people are overly familiar with, but allowed me to tell the story of his kind of botanical interest and the people who shared that with him through the years, in a fresher way, without sort of reiterating details that everybody already knew. I found out some things that were a little bit unusual. And then there's, of course, this huge body of literature on Thoreau. Scholars have been looking at him for years, and fortunately, many people have gone through his very extensive journals and collated, the pithiest quotes and that sort of thing. So there was a there's actually a book called Thoreau on Science, which has all these quotes of the interesting things he said about science. So fortunately, I didn't have to read, every volume of all of his journals, which would have taken me years and made me miss my deadline. But I was able to rely on those other scholars' work to give me the details I needed for the story. So I came home from that trip. I had all this information. I had folders of Xerox copies from the library. I had tapes. I had notes, paper notes, and I went through all of those. And I don't always transcribe all my notes word for word. In that case, I think I did, but that's a judgment call. And I did transcribe my paper notes just because you don't know how long you're going to be able to read your own handwriting. It's often good to have it typed up. It's just easier to read. You don't have to decipher it every single time. And I found that taking an extra day to do it on that end just pays off so much through the process. And then the way I start from once I have that kind of the great details and the important facts and the important explanations, important points I want to make pulled out of my notes, I then start thinking more seriously in scenes. And I've been doing that throughout the process just idly as I talk to people, but I start thinking, okay, instead of doing an outline as people do with term papers, I will make an outline of scenes. Okay, I have this one thing with this professor and his student in the cemetery near Thoreau's grave where they're looking at a flower. That could be a lead. I'm not sure if it will be yet, but let me put that down. And then, what comes next? Well, I should probably, go back to the past and explain what Thoreau was doing, collecting flowers in the 1800s. And then maybe I'll switch back to the present. And so I'll go on like that, and I'll have a rough outline that's really organized, usually quite strongly by scene from beginning to end. So, and that almost always changes before I get to a finished first draft, but it allows you to get started anyway. I sit down with my notes and my sort of with my rough outline up on the screen, and I think the thing that outlining or scene outlining does is it allows you to break down the project. Nothing more horrifying than the blank screen, right? But if you say, okay, I know I have these 8 scenes, or I have these 8 sections, 5 of which are scenes and 3 of which are explanation, that makes it a much less intimidating thing to dive into. So you say, okay, well, today I'm going to work on these first 2 scenes. And so I just start in, and by then I'm pretty familiar with my material. I have a pretty good idea of what kind of quotes I have, just because I've spent a bunch of time with the material at that point. And so often that can be, often you'll find that you've been thinking about it so much that it's not easy. Writing is never easy, but it does tend to roll out. You do feel like it does turn out to be more formed in your mind than you realized. So I'll just go scene by scene, and then sometimes I'll get to the end and I'll read it and it will be terrible, and sometimes I'll get to the end and I'll read it and I'll think 2 of those scenes have to go, these can stay, so then there's that process of revision that inevitably happens even before you turn in a draft to your editor. What I love about research and about being a journalist is that you are a professional amateur. You are never expected to be an expert in anything, but you can be curious about everything. And as a journalist, you have access to people who really are experts and have this wonderful knowledge, that, very unusual, wonderful knowledge, and are out there doing fascinating things. And you have, as a journalist, you have access to them that other people don't have. So you can, go out and join them in the field and spend an evening around the campfire saying, so why are you doing this? And why is this important? And, you can ask them all the questions that other people want to ask, but, don't often have the time or opportunity to do that. So I really appreciate just being able to have a broad, to be kind of a continuing student in a way, to have this broad set of interests that you get to pursue, but that you don't have to spend but you have such variety in your life. You know, I think it's a personality difference. Some people really like to go narrow and deep, and some people like to go wide and not so deep, and I'm one of the latter. I really like to sort of get a broad view of what's out there, so it's satisfying to me. What I don't like and what is inevitable is the stage in your research where you have learned, you know, you're halfway or a third into the project. You've collected this enormous pile of information, but you haven't yet started to make sense of it. You know, the thread of the story or whatever project you're working on hasn't emerged yet. And so there's this long period, and it can last for, or at least it seems long, it can last for, you know, an afternoon, or it can last for several days, or even longer depending on the project, where you're just saying, I have no idea, you know, how I'm ever going to tell this story. It's too big, or it's too complicated, or it's boring, or, you know, these people aren't, you know, doing what I want them to be doing. And that can be really frustrating. And I think when I first started as a journalist, that was terrifying to me, because you think, oh, and a story is never going to come out of this mess, you know, that I've created around myself. But you find that it always does. You know, of course, some stories are better than others, but, you know, if you do the research you're supposed to be doing and you have a good story to begin with, a story comes out of it. And so I think I still don't enjoy that stage for sure, but you do learn that it has an end to it. Of course, you know, you don't want to over-research. You know, you don't want to get too, write down so much or get so deep into it that you just lose track of time. Your deadline helps control that.
Yeah.
And I always think when you start hearing the same thing from people many times, then you know you're done. I think knowing when you're done is important, and I think sometimes it's really hard for people who are starting out, and it's hard for people, I mean, I think it's hard in general to know when you're done, because there's always another person you could call, there's always another book you could read, and so at some point you just have to look at the scope of the project, you have to look at the time you have to look at, you know, just what's realistic, and cut it off at some point. And so you have to admit that you're never going to know everything, which is hard to do, hard to say when the right time is. So. But there's always, you know, I switch back and forth in my process of, you know, I'll research probably 3/4 of it, and then I'll start writing. That's something I didn't say. Yeah, you know, I'll have a really good idea of how it should be structured, what the general scope is, and then I'll start writing, and then holes will emerge, you know, oh, I didn't ask this person, you know, I forgot to ask them, for instance, let's say, I forgot to ask them how they first ran across Thoreau's botanical records, you know, and I'll call the researcher back and ask them that and fill that in. So there is that sort of helps with the knowing that you're done part, you know, that you sort of look at what you have and then figure out what you have to fill in.